The transport ship cut through the gray waters of the English Channel in the summer of 1944. Below deck, hundreds of German soldiers sat in silence, their faces etched with exhaustion and uncertainty. They had been captured during the Allied advance through France following D-Day. Young men, barely out of their teens, sat alongside hardened veterans of the Eastern Front. All of them shared one unspoken fear. What awaited them on British soil? For months they had been told stories by their officers, stories of brutal Allied treatment, stories of starvation camps, stories of revenge. The propaganda machine of the Third Reich had painted a terrifying picture of what happened to German soldiers who fell into enemy hands. As the white cliffs of Dover came into view through the small portholes, more than one young soldier whispered a prayer to himself. Hans Müller, a 23-year-old former student from Hamburg, gripped the edge of his wooden bench. He had been a teacher before the war, conscripted into service in 1942. Now, after 2 years of combat across Europe, his war had ended not with glory, but with surrender. He expected chains. He expected punishment. He expected to pay for the sins of a regime he had never truly believed in. What he would discover in the coming months would change everything he thought he knew about his former enemy. The docks at Southampton were unlike anything the prisoners expected. Yes, there were guards with rifles. Yes, there was barbed wire, but there was also order. There was also efficiency. And most surprisingly, there was humanity. British soldiers directed the prisoners off the ships with firm but not cruel commands. Red Cross workers stood nearby with tea and sandwiches. Tea and sandwiches for enemy soldiers. The prisoners were marched to a transit camp at Kempton Park Racecourse, a temporary facility used for initial processing and interrogation. The interrogations were professional, focused on military intelligence rather than intimidation. The British officers asked about unit positions, command structures, and strategic information. They did not ask about ideology. They did not demand confessions of Nazi loyalty. This was war, but it was war conducted with a certain code. After processing, the prisoners were distributed across Britain to a network of over 500 camps. These camps stretched from the rolling hills of Scotland to the farmlands of East Anglia, from the industrial cities of the Midlands to the pastoral villages of the West Country. Britain, stretched thin by years of war, faced an unprecedented challenge. By 1946, the country would hold over 400,000 German prisoners of war. This was more than any other Allied nation, and it presented both a logistical nightmare and an unexpected opportunity. Hans Müller found himself assigned to a camp in Suffolk, in the heart of England's agricultural region. The camp consisted of wooden huts arranged in neat rows, surrounded by fences and guard towers. It was a prison, make no mistake, but it was not the hell he had imagined. Each hut had beds with mattresses, not just wooden boards. There were wash houses with running water. There was a canteen where prisoners could gather. There was even a small library. The library surprised him most. Shelves lined with books in German, sent by charities and international organizations, novels by Thomas Mann and Hermann Hesse, philosophy texts, poetry collections. How could captors who hated them provide books for their minds? It made no sense according to the propaganda he had been fed. The daily routine began with roll call at dawn. Guards counted heads, checked for any signs of escape attempts, and assigned work details. Under the Geneva Convention, enlisted prisoners could be required to work, and Britain desperately needed labor. Years of war had depleted the workforce. Men were still fighting abroad. Women had taken up roles in factories and essential services. The farms, in particular, faced a critical shortage. Hans and dozens of other prisoners from his camp were transported each morning to nearby farms. They harvested potatoes, tended livestock, repaired fences, and cleared drainage ditches. It was hard physical labor, especially for men who had spent months in combat, inadequately fed and poorly treated by their own army during the chaotic final months of the war. But the British farmers fed them lunch, real food, bread and cheese, and sometimes even meat. They paid them wages, albeit in camp currency that could only be spent at the camp canteen. Something unexpected began to happen in those fields. The initial hostility between British farmers and German prisoners began to soften. At first, there was mutual suspicion. British farmers had sons fighting in Europe, or worse, had received telegrams informing them their sons would never return. The Germans were the enemy. The Germans had bombed British cities. The Germans had started this terrible war, but day after day, working side by side, something changed. The farmers saw that these prisoners were not monsters. They were young men, tired and far from home. They worked hard. They were polite. Many could speak at least some English, learned in school before the war. Conversations began tentatively, a comment about the weather, a question about farming technique, a shared moment of exhaustion at the end of a long day. Walter Thompson, a farmer in his 60s from Norfolk, had lost his youngest son at El Alamein in 1942. When the first German prisoners arrived at his farm in late 1944, he could barely look at them. These were the same uniforms, the same accents as the soldiers who had fought against his boy. But as weeks turned to months, something shifted in his heart. One of the prisoners, a young man named Carl, reminded him painfully of his own son, the same age, the same shy smile, the same love of reading. One cold November afternoon, Walter's wife Mary brought hot tea out to the fields. She poured a cup for Walter, then, almost without thinking, poured one for Carl. It was a small gesture, but it represented something profound, the breaking of an invisible barrier. Carl accepted the tea with tears in his eyes. He had not experienced such simple kindness in years. This scene repeated itself across Britain in countless variations. Farmers who had every reason to hate found themselves unable to maintain that hatred in the face of daily human interaction. The prisoners were not the faceless enemy of propaganda posters. They were friends who carved beautiful wooden toys in his spare time. They were Otto, who could fix any broken machine. They were Joseph, who sang folk songs while working that reminded the farmers of their own traditional melodies. The British government watched this development with interest. From the earliest days of the war, even before the first German prisoners arrived in significant numbers, officials had been thinking about the future. What would happen when the war ended? How could they prevent another catastrophe like the one that followed the First World War? The harsh treatment and economic devastation imposed on Germany after 1918 had created the conditions for Hitler's rise. Britain's leaders were determined not to make the same mistake twice. In January 1946, a special facility opened at Wilton Park in Buckinghamshire. This was no ordinary prison camp. Wilton Park was designed as a residential education center with one ambitious goal: to re-educate German prisoners in the principles of democracy. The man chosen to lead this experiment was Heinz Küppler, a German-Jewish refugee who had fled Nazi Germany in the 1930s. Küppler understood both cultures. He knew what the prisoners had been taught under Nazi rule, and he knew how to reach them. The program at Wilton Park was carefully structured. Selected prisoners, particularly those identified during screening as having anti-Nazi sympathies or at least open minds, were sent there for intensive 6-week courses. The curriculum included lectures from some of Britain's most distinguished thinkers. Bertrand Russell, the famous philosopher, spoke about logic and free thought. William Beveridge, architect of the British welfare state, discussed social democracy. Nancy Astor, a pioneering female politician, talked about women's rights and parliamentary democracy. The prisoners watched documentary films about the liberation of concentration camps. These films were difficult to watch. Many prisoners had not known the full extent of what had been done in their name. Some refused to believe it at first. The propaganda had been so complete, the compartmentalization so total, that average soldiers had been kept ignorant of the Holocaust's industrial scale. Seeing the evidence, incontrovertible and horrifying, shattered something in many of them. But Wilton Park was not just about showing the evils of Nazism. It was equally about demonstrating the strengths of democracy. The prisoners participated in debates. They were encouraged to ask questions, to challenge ideas, to think critically. For men who had spent years in a system that demanded absolute obedience and punished independent thought, this was revolutionary. They could question authority without being punished. They could disagree without fear. Between 1946 and 1948, approximately 2,400 prisoners attended courses at Wilton Park. Many returned returned to their camps profoundly changed. They became informal educators themselves, sharing what they had learned with fellow prisoners. Discussion groups formed in camps across Britain. Prisoners debated politics, philosophy, and the future of Germany. Some remained committed Nazis, but their voices grew increasingly isolated as more prisoners were exposed to alternative ways of thinking. Back at the regular camps, life settled into a rhythm that would have seemed impossible in the early days of the war. The camps had theaters where prisoners put on plays and musical performances. They had sports facilities where they played football and volleyball. They had workshops where skilled craftsmen practiced their trades, creating furniture and handicrafts. Some camps even had small gardens where prisoners grew vegetables and flowers. Young Willy Bungart, captured at age 17, spent 4 years in British camps. He later recalled these years with surprising fondness. He learned carpentry skills from older prisoners. He made friends who would last a lifetime. When Christmas 1945 approached, Willie and his fellow prisoners in a camp in the Midlands decided to make toys for local children. They carved wooden dolls, fashioned pull-along dogs, constructed simple puzzles. The guards allowed them to sell these toys to British families who came to the camp on designated visiting days. The money earned went into the prisoners' camp accounts, but more importantly, the exchange created connections. British mothers chatted with the young German prisoners, amazed at the craftsmanship. Some asked about their families back home. Some shared news from their own sons at the front. These small moments of humanity accumulated, slowly transforming enemies into individuals. But the most remarkable transformation came at Christmas 1946. The war had been over for more than a year, yet hundreds of thousands of German prisoners remained in Britain. This situation troubled many British citizens. The war was won. Why were these men still imprisoned? Debates raged in Parliament. The Labour government of Clement Attlee faced criticism for violating the spirit, if not the letter, of the Geneva Convention. Some accused the government of using slave labor, though the prisoners were paid and worked under reasonable conditions. The true reason for the delay in repatriation was complex. Britain desperately needed the labor. The country was exhausted from 6 years of war. Rationing continued. Reconstruction was only beginning. The prisoners represented a workforce that could help rebuild Britain, while Britain figured out how to rebuild Germany. Additionally, there were concerns about sending prisoners back to a Germany that was devastated, divided, and barely functioning. But public pressure mounted. Organizations like the Quakers advocated for better treatment and faster repatriation. Journalists questioned the morality of indefinite detention. And as Christmas 1946 approached, a remarkable idea emerged. What if British families invited German prisoners into their homes for Christmas dinner? The proposal came initially from Quaker groups in places like Norwich. They suggested that civilians who felt comfortable doing so could invite a prisoner to share their Christmas meal. The government agreed, establishing strict guidelines. Prisoners had to be selected for good behavior. Host families had to register in advance. The prisoners had to return to camp by a specified hour. Most importantly, the host families were responsible for ensuring their guest did not attempt to escape. When the opportunity was announced in the camps, many prisoners could hardly believe it. To be invited into a British home to share a Christmas meal with a family after everything that had happened, it seemed impossible. Hans Müller, now in his 3rd year of captivity, received an invitation from the Thompson family, the farmers he had worked for. Walter Thompson and his wife Mary had discussed it at length. Mary had been hesitant at first, but Walter convinced her. They had lost a son to this war, but Karl, the young German prisoner who worked their farm, had not started the war. He had been a victim of it, just as their son had been. Christmas morning 1946 dawned cold and clear across Britain. In camps throughout the country, selected prisoners prepared for their extraordinary day of freedom. They borrowed civilian coats to cover their prison uniforms, as regulations required. They received temporary passes. Guards wished them Merry Christmas, a phrase that would have been unthinkable just 2 years earlier. Hans Müller walked up the path to the Thompson farmhouse with his heart pounding. He carried a small carved wooden box box he had made in the camp workshop, a modest gift for his host. Mary Thompson opened the door, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Two people from nations that had been at war, two people who had lost so much, two people who were choosing on this day to see each other's humanity. Inside, the house was warm and smelled of roasting turkey. Walter shook Hans's hand firmly. They sat down together, this German prisoner and this British farmer who had buried his son, and they shared Christmas dinner. They talked about farming. They talked about literature. Hans had been a teacher, and Walter was an avid reader. They talked about the weather and crops and the future. They did not talk about the war, except once, when Walter mentioned his son. Hans expressed his sorrow, and Walter nodded, accepting it. This scene repeated itself in hundreds of homes across Britain that Christmas Day. In Yorkshire, a woman whose own son was still serving in the Navy invited a young German prisoner named Joseph to dinner. She later wrote to a newspaper describing her initial nervousness and how it melted away when she saw how grateful and well-mannered the young man was. In Scotland, a family with 3 daughters invited 2 prisoners who played them Christmas carols on handmade instruments. In Wales, an elderly couple who had lost 2 sons invited a prisoner who reminded them of their youngest boy. Not every invitation was accepted. Some prisoners felt uncomfortable, unable to accept kindness from those they had fought against. Some British families who extended invitations were criticized by neighbors who felt the gesture was a betrayal. But thousands of connections were made that Christmas. Thousands of moments of forgiveness and humanity occurred. Thousands of seeds were planted that would grow into lasting friendship. The impact of that Christmas extended far beyond a single day. In camps across Britain, prisoners who had been invited into British homes returned with stories that amazed their fellow prisoners. They described families who had suffered losses in the war, yet chose kindness over revenge. They described the warmth of British homes, the generosity of British tables despite rationing, the genuine interest in their well-being. These stories spread through the camps like wildfire, fundamentally changing how many prisoners viewed their captors. One prisoner wrote a letter to a local newspaper expressing his amazement and gratitude. He described how he had been prepared for cold formality at best, hostility at worst. Instead, he was welcomed into a home where he was treated not as an enemy, but as a guest. The family asked about his own parents in Germany, worried about his return to a devastated homeland, expressed hope that they would all find peace. He wrote that he was moved to tears by their compassion. As 1947 dawned, the pace of repatriation gradually increased. The British government announced that 15,000 prisoners would be sent home each month. But a remarkable thing had happened. Not all prisoners wanted to leave. Some had formed such strong bonds with the communities where they worked that they requested permission to stay. Some had even fallen in love with British women, relationships that developed despite regulations against fraternization that were inconsistently enforced and eventually lifted. Friedrich Schmidt had been captured in North Africa in 1943 and had spent 3 years working on farms in Gloucestershire. He had become friends with the farmer's daughter Elizabeth, and their friendship had blossomed into love. When his turn for repatriation came, Friedrich made an extraordinary request. He wanted to stay in Britain. He wanted to marry Elizabeth. He wanted to make this land, which had been his prison, his home. The authorities faced hundreds of such requests. Eventually, provisions were made for prisoners who wished to remain. They could transition from prisoner of war status to civilian status if they had employment and a place to live. Approximately 25,000 German prisoners chose to stay in Britain after being released from POW status. 25,000 men who decided that the country that had captured them offered them a better future than returning to a Germany divided and devastated. This decision was not made lightly. Germany in 1947 was in ruins. Cities were destroyed. The economy had collapsed. Millions were homeless. The country was divided into occupation zones, with the Soviet zone in the east already showing signs of the harsh communist rule that would last for 4 decades. For many prisoners, especially those from areas that had fallen under Soviet control, returning home meant returning to an uncertain and potentially dangerous situation. But beyond practical considerations, Something deeper motivated the decision to stay. These men had experienced something unexpected in Britain. They had expected punishment and found rehabilitation. They had expected hatred and found friendship. They had expected to be treated as monsters and found themselves treated as human beings. This treatment, more than any propaganda, more than any re-education program, convinced them that democracy and human dignity were real things worth embracing. The British treatment of German prisoners stood in stark contrast to conditions elsewhere. In the Soviet Union, captured German soldiers faced a fate of almost unimaginable brutality. Of the roughly 3 million German prisoners taken by the Soviets, approximately 1 million perished in captivity. They died of starvation, disease, exposure, and maltreatment. Those who survived often spent many years in forced labor camps in Siberia and other remote regions. The last German prisoners were not released from Soviet captivity until the mid-1950s, a full decade after the war's end. Even in the United States, which also treated prisoners generally well, there were differences. American camps were more focused on labor and less on the kind of intensive re-education program Britain implemented. The American public was also less accepting of German prisoners in their midst. There were numerous incidents of hostility and even violence against prisoners in American camps. While conditions were generally humane, the integration and friendship that developed in Britain was less common in America. Britain's approach was not without its critics, even within Britain. Many citizens were uncomfortable seeing German prisoners working in their fields and villages while British soldiers remained abroad. There were protests, most notably by peace campaigner Victor Gollancz, who argued that keeping prisoners for so long after the war's end violated human rights principles. In Parliament, Labour MP Richard Stokes repeatedly challenged the government, insisting that Germans had rights that must be respected regardless of what they had done during the war. These critiques reflected a deep philosophical debate about revenge versus rehabilitation, punishment versus reconciliation. The British government, led by Clement Attlee and Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin, chose rehabilitation. They chose to treat prisoners not just as enemies who had been defeated, but as individuals who could be transformed. This choice was partly pragmatic. Britain needed the labor and wanted stable allies in post-war Europe, but it was also partly idealistic, reflecting a belief that the cycle of violence could only be broken through humanizing the enemy. The camps themselves evolved significantly over the years. Early camps were Spartan, focused on security and basic necessities. But as the months stretched into years, improvements were made. Prisoners were allowed to form orchestras and theater groups. One camp in Warfield hosted concerts where a former opera house musician conducted fellow prisoners in performances open to local villagers. Prisoners attended church services alongside British congregations, initially under strict supervision that was gradually relaxed. In some cases, prisoners were billeted directly with farmers rather than residing in camps. This arrangement provided even greater opportunity for friendship to develop. One Scottish farmer requested permission for his Italian POW workers to live in one of his outbuildings so they wouldn't have to make the long daily trek to and from camp. Similar arrangements developed across the country, particularly in rural areas where labor was desperately needed and camps were sometimes far from farms. The prisoners also left lasting physical legacies. Italian prisoners, who preceded Germans in large numbers, built the famous Italian chapel on Lamb Holm in the Orkney Islands, a beautifully ornate Catholic chapel constructed from Nissen huts and whatever materials they could salvage. German prisoners helped construct the Wembley Way approach to Wembley Stadium in preparation for the 1948 Olympics. They repaired roads damaged by years of neglect during the war. They helped clear rubble from bombed cities. They contributed to building the post-war Britain that emerged from the ashes of conflict. In one remarkable initiative known as the Braintree Experiment, civic-minded citizens in the Essex town of Braintree invited 40 prisoners from a youth camp to tour local institutions. The prisoners visited the police station and courthouse, where officials explained how British law and justice worked. They attended social clubs where they met ordinary British citizens and discussed democracy over tea and biscuits. The experiment was so successful, it was replicated in other communities. These educational initiatives complemented the formal re-education at Wilton Park. Together, they represented a comprehensive effort to demonstrate democracy rather than just lecture about it. The prisoners saw how free citizens lived, how they participated in civic life, how they questioned authority and held governments accountable. They saw newspapers that criticized the government without being shut down. They saw elections where parties competed peacefully. They saw a system that, while imperfect, allowed people to live in dignity and freedom. The winter of 1946 to 1947 tested the relationship between Britain and its prisoners in a new way. That winter was one of the most severe in British history. Record-breaking snowstorms paralyzed the country. Roads were blocked. Railways couldn't run. Coal supplies, already depleted by years of war, couldn't reach homes and factories. The country faced a genuine crisis. German prisoners worked alongside British soldiers and civilians to clear roads and railways. They dug out buried villages. They transported emergency supplies. They stood shoulder to shoulder with the people they had fought against just 2 years earlier, battling not each other but the elements. This shared struggle created bonds that mere words never could. When you've worked all day in freezing conditions to clear a road so that coal can reach a town where children are cold, nationalist divisions seem less important. As repatriation continued through 1947 and into 1948, the camps gradually emptied. Prisoners said goodbye to the farmers they had worked for, the families who had invited them to dinner, the friends they had made. Some partings were tearful. Promises were made to write, to visit if possible, once the world settled. Many of these promises were kept. In subsequent years, former prisoners returned to Britain to visit, bringing their wives and children to show them where they had spent the war years. The last German prisoners left Britain in July 1948, nearly 3 years after the war's end. For Captain Gerhard Glattes, commander of submarine U-39, the first German prisoner captured in September 1939, this meant 7.5 years in British captivity. His experience spanned the entire war and beyond, from the early days of uncertainty to the gradual normalization of relations. When he finally returned to Germany, he carried with him not just memories, but a transformed understanding of the world. The legacy of Britain's treatment of German POWs extended far beyond the individual prisoners. Many of those who passed through Wilton Park and other re-education programs went on to play significant roles in post-war West Germany. They became politicians, educators, business leaders, and journalists. They carried with them the lessons they had learned about democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. They helped build a new Germany, one fundamentally different from the militaristic and authoritarian state that had led them into war. The Federal Republic of Germany, established in 1949 in the Western occupation zones, became a stable democracy and eventually one of Britain's closest allies. While many factors contributed to this transformation, the seeds planted in British POW camps played their part. The prisoners had seen that democracy wasn't just theoretical, it was practical and livable. They had experienced how a society could function with respect for individual rights and human dignity. This first-hand experience proved more powerful than any textbook could have been. The story of German POWs in Britain also changed Britain itself. The experience of hosting these prisoners, of transforming enemies into friends, reinforced British confidence in their own values. In the midst of post-war hardship, with rationing continuing and the empire beginning to dissolve, the successful integration of former enemies provided evidence that British ideals of fair play and human decency were real, not just propaganda. It also taught lessons about the nature of enmity and friendship. The British civilians who initially refused to speak to prisoners who saw them only as the enemy gradually realized that nationality and uniform did not determine character. The German prisoners who arrived expecting cruelty and found kindness learned that propaganda creates walls that human interaction can break down. Both sides discovered that the other was not so different after all. This realization had profound implications. If ordinary Germans could be decent people despite fighting for a monstrous regime, then perhaps individuals should not be judged solely by the actions of their governments. If British families could forgive those who fought for the regime that bombed their cities, then perhaps forgiveness was possible even after the worst conflicts. These lessons learned slowly and painfully through thousands of individual interactions, helped shape the post-war European order. The European integration that began in the 1950s, leading eventually to the European Union, was built partly on this foundation of reconciliation. The idea that former enemies could become partners, that Germans and British could work together rather than fight each other, had been demonstrated at the most personal level in those POW camps and British homes. The grand political project of European unity rested on thousands of small moments of human connection. Today, the story of German POWs in Britain is largely forgotten by the general public, though historians have documented it extensively. The camps are gone, replaced by housing estates or returned to farmland. The prisoners and their British hosts have mostly passed away, but the legacy remains in the descendants of those who stayed, in the lasting friendships between families, in the democratic institutions of Germany, and in the proof that even after the worst conflict, reconciliation is possible. The graves of German prisoners who died in British captivity are carefully maintained, often by local German women's groups and British volunteers. These graves, scattered across Britain in over 40 locations, serve as quiet reminders of this chapter of history. They remind us that even in the midst of total war, humanity can prevail. Even after the worst atrocities, individuals can choose connection over hatred. What made Britain's approach possible? Several factors contributed. Britain itself was not invaded, so the British population did not experience the occupation and brutality that citizens of Poland, France, or the Soviet Union endured. This made forgiveness psychologically easier. Britain also had a strong legal tradition that emphasized fair treatment even of enemies, rooted in centuries of common law development. The government's decision to focus on rehabilitation rather than pure punishment reflected this tradition. Economic necessity also played a role. Britain needed labor desperately, and humane treatment of prisoners ensured their cooperation and productivity. But economics alone cannot explain the depth of connection that developed. The British civilians who invited prisoners to Christmas dinner, despite having lost sons, were motivated by something beyond economic calculation. They were motivated by a sense that the cycle of hatred had to stop somewhere, that someone had to choose mercy. The prisoners themselves showed remarkable resilience and openness. Many arrived broken, demoralized, and indoctrinated with Nazi ideology. They had every reason to remain hostile and resistant. Yet thousands proved willing to question what they had been taught, to engage with new ideas, to see their captors as individuals rather than enemies. This intellectual and emotional courage should not be underestimated. Changing one's worldview, especially when that worldview has been reinforced by years of propaganda and peer pressure, requires strength. The guards and camp administrators who implemented humane policies despite public skepticism also deserve recognition. It would have been easier to maintain strict security and minimal standards. Instead, they created environments where prisoners could read, learn, create, and grow. They took risks by allowing prisoners to work alongside civilians, to attend churches, to interact with communities. These risks were justified by the results, but they required belief that rehabilitation was possible. As we reflect on this history from our vantage point in the 21st century, we can see both its uniqueness and its lessons. The specific circumstances that allowed British-German reconciliation will never be exactly repeated, but the underlying principles remain relevant. The principle that enemies can be transformed through humane treatment. The principle that individuals should not be judged only by the worst actions of their group. The principle that forgiveness and justice can coexist. The principle that our common humanity is stronger than our political divisions. These principles are tested in every conflict, in every moment, when we must choose between revenge and reconciliation. The story of German POWs in Britain reminds us that even after the worst war in human history, people on both sides chose to see each other's humanity. They chose connection over continued hatred. They chose to build bridges rather than walls. The young teacher from Hamburg, Hans Müller, who expected chains when he arrived in Britain, instead found gardens where prisoners grew vegetables, libraries where they could read freely, and eventually a Christmas dinner table where former enemies became friends. His story, multiplied by hundreds of thousands, represents one of the more hopeful chapters in a generally dark period of history. It reminds us that even in humanity's darkest hours, there are always those who choose light. When the last prisoner finally left Britain in 1948, he left behind not just memories, but a changed world. The choice to treat prisoners humanely, to invest in their rehabilitation, to trust in the possibility of transformation had worked. It had not worked perfectly. Some prisoners remained committed Nazis. Some British citizens remained hostile. But it had worked well enough to show that an alternative to vengeance was possible. This alternative path chosen by Britain in its treatment of German prisoners contributed to a Europe that, against all odds, found peace. The German soldiers who expected punishment and found gardens, books, and friendships became builders of a democratic Germany. The British civilians who overcame hatred to extend kindness helped create a post-war order based on cooperation rather than conflict. Together, former enemies built something new from the ruins of war, a testament to human capacity for change and growth, even in the aftermath of unimaginable horror. And so we remember them. The prisoners who expected chains but found freedom of thought. The guards who showed mercy when vengeance would have been easier. The farmers who worked alongside former enemies. The families who opened their homes to those who fought for a regime that bombed their cities. The ordinary people on both sides who chose to see each other's humanity. Their story is not about forgetting the past or excusing the inexcusable. The horrors of World War II, the crimes of the Nazi regime, the millions who died in combat and concentration camps, these remain as dark warnings of what humans are capable of at their worst. But alongside that darkness, the story of German POWs in Britain shows us what humans are capable of at their best. The ability to choose mercy over revenge, connection over division, hope over despair. In a world still plagued by conflict, still divided by old hatreds and new fears, this story offers something precious, proof that change is possible, that enemies can become friends, that the cycle of violence can be broken. The prisoners who expected chains received instead an invitation to join the human family, to participate in building a better world. Many accepted that invitation. In doing so, they helped create the peace that Europe has enjoyed for decades, a peace built not just on treaties and institutions, but on thousands of individual acts of courage, forgiveness, and hope. This is the true legacy of those years when German soldiers became prisoners in Britain, and prisoners became friends. It is a legacy that reminds us, even now, that our choices matter, that individuals can make a difference, and that the best response to hatred is not more hatred, but the patient, difficult, essential work of building human connections across the lines that divide us. Gardens can be planted even in the soil of war. Books can open minds even after years of propaganda. Friendships can form even between enemies. And chains, whether real or imagined, can be broken by the simple but revolutionary act of treating every human being with dignity and respect.